God, Gold and Graves. Episode 2, The Idol Trap. Full script, 60 minutes before we begin. Ask yourself one question. What does God look like to you? Close your eyes. Whatever image came to mind, a painting, a face, a statue, a color, ask yourself, where did that image come from? Who gave it to you? And who benefited from you believing it? Because the story of how the world was colonized is not just a story about land. It is not just a story about gold. It is a story about the most powerful weapon ever deployed against human beings, the manipulation of God himself. This is God, Gold and Graves. And this is Episode 2, The Idol Trap, the Book of Exodus, Chapter 20. God speaks directly to Moses and gives what would become the foundation of 3 of the world's major religions, the 10 Commandments. The first 2 are not complicated. Commandment 1, you shall have no other gods before me. Commandment 2, you shall not make for yourself an image in the form of anything in heaven above or on the earth beneath. You shall not bow down to them or worship them. That is not open to interpretation. No images, no statues, no drawings to kneel before, no carved figures to place on altars. This is God speaking directly, saying, do not do this. So why, by the year 1300 AD, had the Catholic Church filled every cathedral in Europe with exactly that? Paintings of saints covering walls from floor to ceiling, gold statues of the Virgin Mary, crucifixes hung in every home, every school, every government building across the known world. And why, when that same church sent its missionaries to Africa, to the Americas, to Asia, and to the Pacific, did they bring those same images with them and command conquered people to bow before them under penalty of death? This is the first thing they don't teach you in school. The institution that claimed to represent God broke God's most foundational commandments and then used those broken commandments as a tool of control over hundreds of millions of people. By the 1500s, the Catholic Church was the single wealthiest institution on earth, controlling an estimated 1/3 of all land in Europe. That wealth did not come from God. It came from the barrel of a gun and the weight of an idol. To understand how colonialism became a religious project, you have to understand what a papal bull is. A papal bull is an official decree issued by the Pope, considered at the time to be the direct voice of God on earth. Whatever the Pope declared in a papal bull was treated as divine law. No king, no court, no army could override it. If the Pope said it, God said it. That was the system. Now understand what was written in these documents. In 1452, Pope Nicholas V issued a document called Dum Diversas. This document explicitly authorized King Alfonso V of Portugal to invade, search out, capture, vanquish, and subdue all Saracens and pagans, and any other enemies of Christ, and their kingdoms, and to reduce their persons to perpetual slavery. The Vatican authorized the permanent enslavement of African people, in writing, in God's name, in 1452. 3 years later, in 1455, came Romanus Pontifex. This papal bull expanded the authorization. It granted Portugal the exclusive right to trade with and colonize the West African coast. It declared that all lands discovered by Christian explorers that were not already ruled by Christian kings were free to be seized. Read that again. If you were not Christian, if you worshipped in your own tradition, your own way, your own understanding of the divine, your land had no legal protection. The Pope said so. God said so. That was the law. Then came 1493. Columbus had just returned from what he called the New World. Pope Alexander VI issued Inter Caetera, splitting the entire Western Hemisphere between Spain and Portugal. 2 countries divided 2 continents between themselves with a line drawn on a map and a pope's signature. No indigenous nation was consulted. No indigenous voice was heard. Tens of millions of people had their entire world legally erased overnight. These documents, the Dum Diversas, the Romanus Pontifex, the Inter Caetera, became the legal foundation of what historians call the doctrine of discovery. and the doctrine of discovery is still cited in United States federal courts today. In 2005, the U.S. Supreme Court used the doctrine of discovery in the case City of Sherrill versus Oneida Indian Nation. In 2023, just 3 years ago, the Vatican finally issued a formal repudiation of the doctrine of discovery. 3 years ago. It took until 2023 for the Catholic Church to officially say those documents were wrong. 570 years of silence. 570 years of that evil having legal force. When Columbus landed in the Caribbean in 1492, he did not discover an empty land. He arrived on shores populated by millions of people, the Taino, the Arawak, the Lucayan, civilizations with their own governments, their own agriculture, their own spiritual practices, their own histories going back thousands of years. Within 50 years, they were gone. The indigenous population of Hispaniola, modern-day Haiti and the Dominican Republic, was estimated at between 250,000 and 1 million people in 1492. By 1548, it was fewer than 500. That is not a statistic, that is a genocide, and it was carried out in the name of God. Columbus himself wrote in his journals that the native people were gentle, generous, and intelligent, and in the same breath noted they would make good servants. The missionaries who followed him brought crosses and catechisms. The soldiers brought chains and swords. They worked together. The requerimiento was a legal document that Spanish conquistadors were required to read aloud to indigenous populations before attacking them. It explained, in Spanish, that the Pope had given their land to Spain, that they were required to accept Christianity, and that if they refused, any violence done to them would be their own fault. It was read in a language no one understood. Sometimes it was read at night, to empty forests, before dawn attacks. The soldiers had a legal document. They had covered themselves. The church had approved it. Hernando Cortés arrived in Mexico in 1519. The Aztec Empire at that time was one of the most sophisticated civilizations on Earth. A city in Tenochtitlan that was larger than any city in Europe, with running water, organized markets, advanced medicine, and complex governance. 2 years later, it was rubble. Estimates of the pre-conquest indigenous population of the Americas range from 50 million to 100 million people. Within 150 years of European contact, 90% were dead, killed by war, forced labor, and disease weaponized through displacement. Francisco Pizarro conquered the Inca Empire in Peru with 168 men. Not because the Inca were weak, they were not, but because they had never encountered smallpox. The disease, carried by Europeans, moved faster than any army. By the time the Spanish arrived in force, entire communities had already been hollowed out, and everywhere the conquerors went, the missionaries followed. They burned the books. The Mayan codices, thousands of years of recorded knowledge, astronomy, mathematics, history, medicine, burned by Bishop Diego de Landa in 1562. He burned them because they contained, in his words, nothing but superstition and the devil's lies. Of the hundreds of Mayan codices known to exist, only 4 survived. The rest were destroyed by the Catholic Church. Long before European colonizers arrived in Africa, the continent was home to some of the most advanced civilizations in human history. The Kingdom of Mali, the Songhai Empire, Great Zimbabwe, the Kingdom of Congo, the Ethiopian Empire, Egypt, which needs no introduction. Africa was not a dark continent. That phrase, the dark continent, was invented by European explorers to justify what they were about to do to it. The transatlantic slave trade began in earnest in the mid-1400s, authorized by those same papal bulls. Between 1500 and 1900, an estimated 12 to 15 million African people were forcibly taken from their homes and shipped across the Atlantic. Millions more died on the journey, known as the Middle Passage, where enslaved people were packed into ships with no room to stand, no sanitation, no dignity. The mortality rate on slave ships during the Middle Passage ranged from 10 to 20% per voyage. In the worst periods, 1 in 5 people who boarded a slave ship died before reaching the other shore. And the Church was not a bystander. The Vatican owned enslaved people. Individual priests and bishops owned enslaved people. The Jesuits, one of the most powerful Catholic orders, ran large plantation operations in Maryland and Louisiana using enslaved African labor well into the 19th century. In 1838, Georgetown University, a Jesuit institution, sold 272 enslaved people to pay off the university's debts. The sale kept Georgetown financially solvent. Those 272 human beings made an American university possible. Then came the Berlin Conference of 1884 and 1885. 14 nations, all European, none African, gathered in Berlin and divided the entire African continent among themselves. The Congo given to King Leopold II of Belgium as his personal property. East Africa divided between Britain and Germany, West Africa carved up between France, Britain and Portugal, Southern Africa already under British control through the Cape Colony. The continent was divided by people who had never set foot in most of it. Borders were drawn with rulers across maps, splitting ethnic groups, cutting through trade routes, separating families. Borders that still exist today and still drive conflict today. And the missionaries went with every colonial force. There is a saying that circulated among African people at the time that captures something true about that era. When the missionaries came to Africa, they had the Bible and we had the land. They said, "Let us pray." We closed our eyes. When we opened them, we had the Bible and they had the land. King Leopold II of Belgium's rule over the Congo was perhaps the most explicit example of colonial atrocity in history. Leopold claimed to be bringing Christianity and civilization to the Congolese people. He ran the Congo as a rubber extraction operation. Under his rule from 1885 to 1908, the Congolese population declined by an estimated 10 million people. Hands were cut off as punishment for failing to meet rubber quotas. Villages were burned. Women and children were held hostage to force men to work. This was not done in spite of Christianity. It was done beneath its banner. Leopold built churches in the Congo. He funded missions. He used the language of salvation to cover an operation of mass murder. India in 1700 accounted for roughly 25% of global GDP. 1/4 of all the world's economic output came from India. By the time Britain formally ended its colonial rule in 1947, that figure had dropped to under 4%. Economist Utsa Patnaik estimated in 2018 that Britain extracted approximately $45 trillion worth of wealth from India during the colonial period. The British brought missionaries to India as well. They established schools that taught Indian children that their own languages, their own religions, Hinduism, Islam, Sikhism, Buddhism, were inferior. They established a system of governance designed to pit different communities against each other. Divide and rule. A strategy that would eventually contribute to the partition of 1947, one of the largest forced migrations in human history. The partition of India and Pakistan displaced between 10 and 20 million people and resulted in the deaths of an estimated 200,000 to 2 million people in communal violence along religious lines deliberately inflamed by British colonial policy. In Australia, British colonizers declared the continent terra nullius, empty land, despite the presence of the world's oldest continuous civilization. The Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples had lived on that continent for at least 65,000 years. Terra nullius declared them legally non-existent. The Aboriginal population of Australia before British colonisation is estimated at between 300,000 and 1 million people. By 1900, it had been reduced to approximately 60,000 through massacres, displacement, and disease. The stolen generations, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children forcibly removed from their families and placed in church-run institutions, continued from the 1800s into the 1970s. The stated goal was to eliminate Aboriginal culture. Australia did not formally apologise to the stolen generations until 2008. Now let us bring it back to where we started: the commandment, the image, the idol. The Catholic Church did not fill its cathedrals with paintings and statues out of artistic enthusiasm. These images served a specific function in a world where the vast majority of people could not read. If you cannot read the Bible, you cannot interpret it for yourself. You depend on the priest, and the priest depends on the church, and the church depends on its power over you. Images were control. When missionaries arrived in the Americas, they did not just tell indigenous people about a new God. They showed them pictures: a white God, a white Jesus, white angels, dark-skinned figures representing sin, temptation, the devil. This was not accidental. This was a system. The image of a European-looking Jesus was not just a theological statement. It was a political statement. It told every person who saw it, the divine looks like them, not like you. And if God looks like your conqueror, then your conqueror has divine authority over you. And that system has not ended. It has just been updated. Go to any AI right now. Ask it to draw Jesus Christ. It will give you the Western image: long light hair, light skin, blue or green eyes, every single time. Without hesitation, without a disclaimer, without a single historical footnote. Now ask that same AI a historical question about Jesus. Ask it where he was born. It will tell you Bethlehem, in the region we now call Palestine. Ask it what people from that region looked like in the 1st century. It will tell you they were of Middle Eastern descent, olive to dark brown skin, dark hair, dark eyes. It knows the history. It has the history. But the moment you ask it to draw him, all of that history disappears and the Western image comes right back. That is not a glitch. That is the colonial image so deeply embedded in the data, so deeply trained into the machine, that even artificial intelligence defaults to the idol, the fake one, the one that was manufactured to make conquest feel holy. And this matters more than people realize, because people are going to those AI tools and asking for images of a higher power to pray to. They are asking for images of Jesus to put on their walls, to send to their families, to use in their worship. And what they are getting back is a fabricated image, one with no historical basis, one that was designed centuries ago to serve an empire. That is not a connection to God. That is an idol. And the commandment is clear about what an idol is and what worshipping one means. The technology is new, the deception is not. By 1600, an estimated 9 million indigenous people in the Americas had been baptized into the Catholic Church, many by force, many under threat of violence. Conversion was not spiritual, it was administrative. It marked you as a subject of the church and the crown. The same pattern repeated in Africa, in Asia, in the Pacific, everywhere. The image preceded the chain, the cross preceded the gun, or more accurately, they arrived together. And the commandment, do not make for yourself an image, was the commandment they broke specifically to do this, because an imageless God cannot be controlled. An imageless God cannot be weaponized. If God is spirit, formless, without race, without nationality, without allegiance to any empire, then no empire can claim him. That is exactly why they gave him a face. We are not talking about ancient history. We are talking about now. The nations that were colonized are the nations that today are called developing nations. The nations that did the colonizing are the nations that today are called the developed world. That is not coincidence. That is consequence. The 10 wealthiest nations on Earth today include 7 former colonial powers. The 10 poorest nations on Earth today are almost entirely nations that were colonized. That relationship is not accidental, it is structural. The wealth gap between the global North and the global South continues to grow, not because of culture, not because of intelligence, not because of any inherent quality of the people, because the systems put in place during colonialism were designed to keep extracting, and they were never dismantled. They were just renamed. The International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, structural adjustment programs that forced formerly colonized nations to open their markets to foreign corporations in exchange for loans they could never fully repay. Colonial borders that ensure ethnic conflict. military presence in resource-rich regions under the name of peacekeeping or counter-terrorism. The Church, too, has never fully reckoned with what it did. The 2023 repudiation of the doctrine of discovery came with no reparations, no return of looted artifacts. The Vatican Museum houses an estimated 70,000 works of art, many taken from colonized peoples. No formal apology for the specific role of papal bulls in authorizing slavery and conquest. The British Museum holds an estimated 8 million objects. A significant portion were taken from colonized nations, including the Benin bronzes from Nigeria and thousands of objects from Egypt, India, and across the Pacific. As of 2024, the vast majority have not been returned. This is the world that colonialism built, and we are living in it right now. And there were people who saw all of this clearly, long before most people were ready to hear it. In 1992, a former United States Navy intelligence officer named Bill Cooper sat in front of a microphone and made a series of statements that, at the time, sounded extreme, impossible, even irrational to most people who heard them. He talked about a global power structure that operated behind the visible governments of the world. He talked about secret societies, the Freemasons, the Illuminati, the Council on Foreign Relations, organizations he said had been quietly steering the direction of nations, wars, economies, and religions for centuries. He talked about the deliberate manipulation of the public through media, through fear, and through the weaponization of faith. He said a major event would be engineered to justify a permanent shift in how governments controlled their populations. He said the Middle East would be the stage. He said the name Osama bin Laden specifically, years before September 11, 2001. He was killed by law enforcement outside his home in Arizona in November 2001, 2 months after the towers fell. Now understand something. Bill Cooper was not just a man with theories. He was a man with documents. He had spent years inside the intelligence apparatus of the United States military. He had seen things. And what he described, the use of religion as a control system, the manufactured consent of populations, the hidden hand behind colonial and post-colonial power, lines up directly with everything this documentary has been showing you through the historical record. He understood that the same institution that handed colonized people a false image of God was part of a much larger system. A system that used the Bible and the cross the same way it used flags and constitutions, as symbols to make people comply, to make people fight, to make people give up their land, their labor, their lives, and their minds, without ever questioning who was actually benefiting. He said the people will not wake up until it is too late, unless someone keeps telling the truth. That is what this documentary is. That is what your awakening has to be. Not panic, not fear, knowledge. Because the system only works on people who do not know it exists. Cooper also pointed to something that connects directly to this episode: the idol. He understood that controlling the image of God was one of the most powerful tools ever developed. When you control what people believe God looks like, sounds like, approves of, and demands, you control the people. You make them worship the system while thinking they are worshipping the divine. That is what the papal bulls did in 1452. That is what the missionaries did in the Congo. That is what the AI image generators are doing right now in 2026, defaulting to the colonial face every single time someone asks to see God. The weapon has not changed. Only the technology delivering it has. So what do we do with this? We start by knowing it. You cannot heal from something you were never told happened. You cannot understand why the world looks the way it does if they only teach you half the story. And they have been teaching you half the story your entire life. The commandment says, do not worship idols. Do not bow before images made by human hands. Worship God in spirit and in truth. What they gave colonized people was not God. It was an institution dressed up as God, an empire with a cross on top of it. A system of control that used the most sacred language human beings have ever spoken, the language of faith, of eternity, of the divine, and weaponized it. Finding God, finding real healing, means stripping all of that away. It means going back to the source, not the paintings, not the statues, not the AI-generated image that defaults to the colonial version every single time, not the institution with blood on its hands and gold in its walls. The Spirit, the truth, the God that no empire can contain and no papal bull can authorize. That God is still here. He was here before Columbus. He was here before the Berlin Conference. He was here before every conquest, every chain, every burned codex, every stolen child, every cut hand, every grave without a name. And he is here now.